Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. So, what would you do if you're an exporter to Britain of some tasty food treats that the sheep-infested Plague Island enjoys at Christmas, and you suddenly found yourself having to find a vet in order to complete expensive paperwork before you can sell to your British customers? Would you continue to try and sell to Britain? We're going to find out later this year. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, I discussed the government's announcement recently about standards controls finally coming in. Very briefly, it's going to happen in 3 stages, with the 3rd stage aiming to land October 2024. So that's going to be after just after the next general election. So almost certainly another Tory mess that Labour will have to deal with, and they will not have long to deal with it, will they? They are not going to have long to deal with it. They'll have only just won the election. I mean, hey, if the Tories are going to lose the next election, they may as well leave as much mess as possible for their successors, right? Because that's what a responsible government does. But the 1st stage is landing this autumn. Health certificates will be required for some goods being imported into Britain from the EU. To be clear, the government needs to do this if we're going to be a 3rd country. In fact, the absence of measures like this for imports from the EU has been a huge problem for British businesses competing with the rest of Europe. Most especially farmers have been most worried about it. Ever since January the 1st, 2021, all British exporters of certain goods of plant and animal origin have needed a health certificate to accompany them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be allowed across the newly elected trade board, you see. One famous consequence of this was explained by the owner of the Cheshire Cheese Company. He used to sell small individual consignments of cheese around Europe to individual customers, but that all ended overnight. The reason being that the health certificate cost more than the consignment of goods he was sending. Like, people don't want to pay treble the price just to have a health certificate. So he has since, by the way, done a deal, sort of basically partially sold the business off to another one, I think, who had a setup on the continent, which means that what he can effectively now do is send large amounts of his cheese in one go, where the health certificate then becomes viable, and then distribute it from, I think it might be the Netherlands. It's often the Netherlands. Because that is the only way to export viably. It's to send so much at once that it's worth the cost of the health certificate. Ram the lorry full of it. And this has meant British businesses facing 2 options. First, establish storage and distribution in the EU. And as I say, the Netherlands has been very popular for this. And then you send your produce from Britain by the lorry load to that EU-based centre. And then you distribute the individual consignments, the much smaller ones, to EEA-based customers from there. It keeps your business going. It comes at a cost, which means less profit. Also means transferring jobs from Britain to the EU. So it boosts taxes in the EU, it boosts job opportunities in the EU, and reduces them in Britain. Still, that's what Leave voters voted for. They knew they were voting for that, so it's all fine. No one's going to complain. Your second choice is to simply not export to the EU at all. However, up until this October, or the end of this October, really November, I should say, EU businesses have not had to do the same. We have not required any health certificates for EU goods being exported to Britain. This has been very bad news for food producers in particular, because we have to comply with a lot of restrictive trade barriers that competitors in the EU do not. It's not been a level playing field. But some of that is going to change in 6 months. We will, from this autumn, require EU exporters to have a health certificate for similar products. Now, let's imagine how EU businesses are going to respond to that. So some of them send their produce in bulk anyway. If they're selling to a major supermarket, then the supermarket will just cover the costs and the price goes up for us, but that trade is still likely to continue. It's the smaller consignments that are the issue. If either the process of arranging the health certificate or the cost of doing so is not viable, that EU business, they face the same 2 options that British businesses faced. Either build facilities in Britain and send whole lorry loads over at once, or cancel your exports to Britain. Small suppliers won't be able to afford to set up in another country. There's also the issue that British businesses were in one market and trying to export to a much larger market. So there was more chance it would be worth it for a British business to move some of their business overseas. EU-based businesses are already in the much larger market and are facing barriers to export into the smaller market now. An EU-based business is more likely to be able to choose to sacrifice the British trade rather than go on to the expense of setting up facilities in another country which will allow it to supply just one country. Of course, the relative size of the sales will be an important factor, but by and large, we're going to find ourselves unable to buy smaller consignments of certain goods directly from the EU once this change is made. At the very least, expect good quality restaurants to start doing their nut towards the end of this summer. But we will all suffer in terms of either the reduced consumer choice or higher price for the foods we can still get. And one thing is for certain, those continental Christmas treats are going to be more expensive. See, ordinarily you would think that anything with a long shelf life might get away with it this year, because supermarkets, because this comes in November the 1st really, supermarkets could get extra in ahead of the October 31st date, you would think, store it all. So, you know, before the health certificates are needed. So maybe you're thinking, well, it's the following Christmas really. But we have a bit of a supply chain problem in not having enough lorry drivers as it is. So even doing that could get pricey and add to the costs anyway. But for fresh food, without a long date on it, health certificates are going to be needed. It doesn't just mean the cost of the certificate either. You have to find the vets to issue it. So even where the cost is viable for a large exporter, say, it might be that the sudden demand for vets who could do it causes an administrative backlog. You know, we may find that it's actually quite difficult to find the vets, even if you can pay for it to do it. It's like, oh, it's not going to be like a month waiting list. Oh, that's no good. I need to deliver it next week. And then there's another problem which EU businesses will face this autumn, which British businesses faced over 2 years ago. Do they even understand the processes? Because so far I've described it from the point of view of a business in the EU that actually knows what to do. Before Brexit, almost any business in Europe could export to almost every other business in Europe as easily as doing business with someone inside their own country. Overnight, this changed as the UK became a third country, or at least Britain did. Northern Ireland, separate deal. Exciting deal, according to Rishi Sunak. British exporters had to deal with full customs and standards checks overnight because the EU were ready to apply them all at once. Not piecemeal like the UK government. They were faced with mountains of extra paperwork and the costs associated with it, but they were also faced with having to learn skills they never needed before. Before Brexit, you might think, if you were a British-based company and you were exporting around Europe, you might think that you exported internationally. But you didn't have to know how to export internationally because you're inside the same market. Well, most, especially smaller businesses, you know, didn't need to learn those skills. How do you export to a foreign market? Because it wasn't a foreign market. It was a foreign country, but not a foreign market. There were enough customers inside the single market, you didn't really need to push it around the rest of the world. Sending your goods to Rotterdam was as easy as sending them to Rotherham. Not since 2021. Well, from November, EU businesses are going to have to learn a new set of skills themselves. That of dealing with standards controls. Now, it will come in phases. It's not all at once. According to the current plans, 3 phases. The first is this November. The second is next January. And then the third is the following November. Better than all at once, certainly. But it nonetheless means that EU businesses may soon have the same experience that British businesses had. That is, they may try and comply with the new rules. They may feel that it is still part of a viable business model. They may go, well, the health certificate, yeah, we can afford that. But they may not be all that expert in actually managing the process. Things can go wrong. Fortunately, we're not actually planning on checking anything immediately. So if it does go wrong, they'll get away with it because no one will be there to check it. But at some point, we are going to check. And we are likely to find that some are getting their paperwork wrong. Those businesses will then find their consignment stuck at Calais, not going anywhere. Like a lot of British businesses when they found their stuff stuck at Dover and eventually decided to sod the whole thing. Some of them managed to get through it. Some of them managed to learn. They suffered lost business to begin with. They suffered reputational damage to begin with. Some of them got through it. Some of them did not and just had to cut off that part of the business or indeed the whole business. Those businesses in the EU now, as they go through this process, may decide the process is too much hassle, even if it isn't too much money, and give up on the British market. And as people have kept trying to say, Brexit didn't just happen when we left the EU, or even when we left the Single Market and Customs Union. The government delayed lots of Brexit measures to spread them out over many years. There's still more to come. Often the worst ones are still to come. Even the Trading Cooperation Agreement isn't set. We need to renegotiate parts of it after the next election, whoever's in government, because that's just part of the process. Brexit still has more phases to come in. The Tories are hoping that these phases can emulate the frog in the boiling water, that people get used to each new phase of problems and accept it as a normal before the next one comes along. Certainly, if we applied them all at once, I think there might actually have been rioting. I definitely think there would have been a huge public backlash. But Brexit is still happening, bit by bit, bit by bit. We have much more to look forward to. The government are planning to introduce full standards controls by November next year. So Christmas 2024, if it all goes according to plan, will be a bit of a spectacle if that happens. The good part is that Labour will absolutely have to motor with their plans to align with the EU. If the election is autumn 2024 and the final phase is coming autumn 2024, that'll be interesting. Yeah, they could, in theory, postpone the full implementation of standards checks, but then the Tory press would murder them. So in reality, a Labour government will be motivated to work very, very quickly on reversing the most damaging parts of Brexit as much as they can, within, of course, the electoral strategy constraints that they have. But until then, we're sat here watching more and more Brexit taking away what we used to take for granted. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships, and until next time, I'll see you later.